history is being made every day. Some of us might feel like we can't keep up with what happened last week, let alone remember everything that has ever happened to every person who has ever lived.
So, today we're going to talk about the parts of history that groups of people have chosen to remember.
The way in which we choose to commemorate an event communicates to each other and younger generations what's important to us as a culture.
The past doesn't change. What happened, happened.
But the parts we choose to remember and pass on might not always be based on the full story.
You mean to tell me that two different groups of people could experience the same event but choose to remember different details, then pass on those two sets of details, which create two divergent collective memories of the same event?
Yep. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but we only have 10 minutes for this video. So, we remember the big ones, our national victories, traumas, and internal struggles. But what about the big moments in our history that we don't really talk about anymore? History's complicated, and whoever thought we could cram it all into one book was a little too ambitious.
For example, we just celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
The American woman suffrage movement is a huge part of our history. It lasted over 70 years, used only peaceful tactics, and created the largest enfranchisement in our nation's history.
Yet, in many textbooks, it only gets a few oversimplified paragraphs. Most say that voting rights were given or granted to women.
Oh.
Even though women fought long and hard to prove that as U.S. citizens, we deserved an equal voice in government.
Well, let's see what this one says. Ooh, 1955.
It smells funny.
It has taken many years, but women have won many of their goals.
Yay!
In 1920, they received the right to vote. Today, women have practically the same legal rights as men.
In the 1950s?
Women have also found their life at home more pleasant.
There it is.
Now they are usually treated as equals.
Usually.
In America today, women have gained more equality with men than
I'm sorry, equality? In the 1950s? Whose version of equality are we using here? I mean, whose history is that? It surely isn't the history my grandmother was living.
Of course, the ways in which the suffrage story has been told have varied greatly over the past 100 years. But however you slice it, no two paragraphs in a textbook can do it justice.
Wait, maybe we can.
What?
Do it justice. Or at least capture some of the complexities that guy glossed over.
Okay, do it in 2 paragraphs?
No, do it in 2 minutes. Can't do worse than this guy.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott gathered some people together to unveil the Declaration of Sentiments and kick off the official suffrage movement.
Frederick Douglass was there too.
That is true.
After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The next step towards the American ideal of equality was voting rights, or suffrage.
But suffrage for whom?
It is the Negro's hour. Black men first, and surely women's suffrage won't be far behind.
We worked together for abolition and we will work together for universal voting rights. But if you insist on prioritizing, then we refuse to take second place. The organization fragmented.
Conflict.
Rivalry. Contradiction.
Some time passed. Many dedicated suffragists kept the movement going, sometimes under the umbrella of other causes.
I smashed 5 saloons with rocks before I ever took a hatchet. The suffragists who broke up got back together.
With the Golden Age came more freedoms for the new woman. The suffrage movement experienced a reboot.
Oh, thanks!
More suffragists were meeting, organizing, and strategizing.
Speaking tours, lobbying Congress, oh, soapbox presentations, pamphlets, propaganda, parades, protesting, prison, hunger strikes, and enduring painful forced feedings. These strategies raised awareness in the press, built sympathy for the cause, and through the dueling strategies of militancy and ladylike effort for the war effort, President Woodrow Wilson finally gave his support. The 19th Amendment was passed in the House, in the Senate, and in 1920 was ratified in Nashville, Tennessee, because one man listened to his wise mama and changed his mind, securing for all women the right to vote!
Not all women.
We're celebrating here. You're right. Something was missing from that recap.
Yeah. The achievements and contributions of the African American communities have often been deleted from the dominant narrative. I have to admit, most of this wasn't included in my public school education. But friends, learning and exploring doesn't end with your high school diploma. When I realized that the 19th century African American women were leaders in education, politics, and activism, I felt slighted, and I wanted to learn more. My first question was, what sparked the women's suffrage movement in the first place?
First off, suffragists wanted the same unalienable rights articulated in the nation's foundational documents.
After all, the first 3 words of our Constitution are, "We the people."
And the main idea of the Declaration of Sentiments that we mentioned at the top of that chaos earlier was that all men and women are created equal. Beyond this idea of equality, suffragists wanted the right to vote so they could have the power to improve the country they loved. Better education, food safety standards, healthcare, safer working conditions, and child labor laws.
If the man in her life made bad choices, wouldn't it be nice to have some autonomy in legal affairs, like divorce, property rights, and custody rights?
They also wanted a stake in activities outside the home, like stricter liquor laws and prison reform.
Black women had an even greater need for legal protections. In a nation plagued by racism, the need for a voice in their own government was vital.
They endured the double burden of sexism and racism.
Yep. So they started to form their own autonomous clubs to support and improve women involvement in organizations dedicated to Black progress. You see, by the end of the Civil War, African American women were being recognized in their own circles for their work as teachers, organizers, and advocates for their communities.
But whatever progress was made by African American men and women in the few years during Reconstruction, it began to crumble as a white supremacist backlash fueled the Jim Crow era, in which state and local laws were made to segregate, discriminate, intimidate, criminalize, and disenfranchise the Black population.
So, from their perspective, even if Black women did put all their energy into getting the right to vote, they would encounter the same obstacles that Black men were facing. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, intimidation, violence, and lynching.
Any love from their fellow white ladies in the suffrage movement?
There were some notable suffragists who worked across the racial divide, but mostly they claimed that race issues were separate from women's issues.
Which would make anyone feel unseen or unwelcome at meetings, parades, protests.
Exactly. For the most part, Black women recognized that no one was going to advocate for them, so they started their own movement.
Black women were participating at various levels. Powerful speakers traveled the country, stirring up empathy and changing minds.
Engaging personalities from the 19th century like Sojourner Truth, who could neither read nor write, yet captivated audiences with her unique candor.
Educated elites like Mary Church Terrell, who pushed for suffrage activism even when other Black women wanted to distance themselves, and represented at predominantly white suffrage events and conventions.
And activists like Ida B. Wells, who forced the nation to acknowledge the horrors of lynching and started numerous organizations that mobilized to register Black voters.
But these women were not carrying the Black women's rights movement alone.
Countless women strove to stay active in their communities at home and in their local churches, adding advocating for the right to vote to their long list of responsibilities. Although the support within their own communities waned, they pressed forward with their philanthropy, organizing to form more Black women's clubs all across the country. In 1896, almost 200 of these clubs joined to form the National Association of Colored Women. They are still active today.
They adopted the motto, "Lifting as we climb," communicating the acknowledgement that not all women have equal resources, and if those who have more reach out to help those who have less, then women advance together.
I like that.
Me too. So, why is it important for us to remember all the work that didn't make it into the history books?
Because we're still grappling with racism and voting rights 100 years later.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 reinforced the 15th Amendment, disallowing the poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation at the polls. This expanded voter registration and participation.
Then, in 2013, the Supreme Court made a decision in Shelby County versus Holder that struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act, empowering local officials to change voting laws without federal oversight.
Within just 5 years, more than half our states had changed their laws, making voting more difficult.
And research shows that these laws reduce participation, not only among communities of color, but also low-income voters, students, older citizens, and people with disabilities.
And after the 2020 election, there was a flurry of new laws, some of which made access easier, but over 1/3 of our states enacted laws to make voting harder. Billy, I remember some of the documentation you did around Washington, D.C. in 2020.
Yeah, I photographed and recorded what was happening around the city. We were constantly exchanging stories and resources. We urged the communities to vote. We let them know in advance which laws and restrictions might affect them disproportionately. We talked to people without access to funds needed to get the required identification, people without housing who wouldn't be able to provide the proof of residency, and people who simply didn't have access to transportation. That way they couldn't make it to the polls. Not everyone was receiving their mail-in ballots. We were getting involved, helping each other, documenting our challenges, and being an active part of history. To some people, voting may seem insignificant, but in the past, people of color have died trying to exercise their right to vote. And we can't forget those sacrifices that got us here today. Voting may not be the only solution, but I do believe it's a huge step towards changing our future. It's a way of locking in all of the work that we're doing to fight against systemic racism,
And sexism,
homophobia,
income inequality,
education inequality.
climate change, just to name a few.
So, what did we learn today?
That movements are messy, progress is complicated, change takes time, and 2 paragraphs can't do justice to the complexity of our history, or to all those who contributed.
The journey towards equity isn't over. We don't have to look far to see the vestiges of the ugliest part of our nation's history. It's not just a historical issue. It's an issue of now.
Instead of being passive spectators in the creation of history, we can be an active part of change.
Let's build a collective memory of our shared past by documenting and celebrating our own stories.
These are the stories that will help history look more well-rounded and a lot more like what we are really experiencing.
Something layered, complicated, and beautiful.
We can use whatever resources we have to build empathy, raise awareness, support a cause,
Oh, and lift as we climb.
building a more just and compassionate future for all.